I would like to have more insight in how two virtues relate to each other. The first virtue is humility. In the rare occasions that I truly abided in humility, I was baffled by the binning effect of this state. It is such an easy state to be in, and no energy spent on upholding a certain image of facade. The other virtue, if I can call it, a virtue of seeing ourselves as by nature already fully realized, divine beings, powerful beyond measure, and to familiarize ourselves with this sense of I am Shiva, even when we do not experience this yet. In a commentary by Swami Lakshmanju, I read about this. Quote, "Whatever you think that gets its shape, it comes true. If you think I am Parambhairava, it will get its shape true. If you think I am not, I am a trodden, I am a fool, I am worth nothing, then you are worth nothing." So there is great value in being constantly aware of our greatness, and there is tremendous value in humility. I see that both can perfectly coexist, but my ego still likes to disturb that integral balance. Question. I guess my question is how to develop both at the same time, or is it advisable and more effective to focus on one of these virtues for some period? Good one. Let's pour some tea. So in other words, which virtue to give preference, right? Which virtue to give priority? I suggest first let's examine what is a virtue. And we can look into the dictionaries now, we can look into the synonymous or related words. Virtue, and you are welcome to translate that into your mother tongue so it becomes even clearer, so it has that suck with the milk of the mother feeling to it, like literally. You can feel the term in your mouth. What is virtue? Virtue is something by virtue of its quality we consider to be what sets a certain psychological tendencies above others. That's what virtue is. And you need to first clearly understand what virtue in itself. You do remember when we spoke at one of the retreats this year in Belgium, that I've encouraged all of you to cultivate two virtues. And that is vigilance, right? Well, two qualities, vigilance and virtues, precisely why the question comes forth from you. Because I did suggest that, to cultivate virtues. Because unless we don't cultivate virtues, and let's say something happens to our consciousness, it will be virtually, again, impossible to do so. It is for that reason virtues in yogic terminology known as yamas and niyamas, internal and external conduct, or could else be said, internal attitude and external behavior. These are yamas and niyamas. They form, classically speaking, the first two limbs of yoga. We speak of the eightfold yoga of Patanjali, and the first come these two. But you're bringing, you see, onto the same plane of question two qualities. And I'd like you now to look into it from this perspective. Whilst humility, we could say, is a virtue, and having one's recognition, even if that's a bold, and we could say, in inverted commas, in advance identification with the utmost essence of ourselves. That is what, in the quote of Swami Lakshmanju, I am Parabrahman or Parabhairav, the same. Brahman or Bhairav, it's the same, just different words in Sanskrit. One is more tantric used, one is more Vedically used, but it stands for that, for the absolute. This has nothing to do with virtues. This is not a virtue. To develop or work on one's humility, to recognize that essentially nothing that we do is due to our greatness or our failures, brings the true humility. The true humility is actually that. It's removing ourselves from the picture, whilst at the same time still taking a stance of responsibility. Not an easy thing to do. So this is why we need to go carefully here. We need to tread carefully before we can jump into ready-made conclusions, any ready-made conclusions with regard to this question you've asked. So in other words, humility, we could say, has its opposites, just as the term humility has various synonymous words, right? Humbleness and so forth, modesty, humility, what stands for. But it has also its opposite, that what humility is not, lack of humility, and all that is, right? Self-aggrandizement, immodesty, right? Boastfulness, and you can find your own ones. Just, 5 of synonymous words and 5 that denotes its opposite. And you can see that, indeed, humility is just a quality, a psychological quality that we all collectively agreed, and perhaps it is even shared through various cultures independently on otherwise historiological setup. Humility is true in China, humility is true in Japan, humility is true in Russia, humility is true in Belgium, humility is true in Canada and in Peru, and so forth. Irrespective of the time and so forth. Maybe degrees slightly and subtleties, but there is this universal recognition that humility is that. It's that act of modesty with, in other words, holding that attitude of one's humility in relation to whatever that is. However, humility does not stand as, as humility stands in opposition to many other terms, which humility is not. Humility does not stand in opposition to your essential nature. This is why you need to first re-examine the very nature of these terms. The declaration, Aham Brahmasmi, I am totality, or Shivoham, I am Shiva, or Aham Siddha, I am perfection, I am perfect. Perfect here, not in terms of perfect psychological setup. I am more perfect than someone else. I am perfect comparing to how I was 2 years ago. I am perfect in relation to how good I was, let's say, at painting this picture or making this meal. I've mastered the technique. That's not perfection we're speaking about. It's innate perfection of my being, and realization and recognition of that is what Siddha stands for. The term Siddha is that. It's someone who inherently realizes innate perfection of one's being. It has nothing to do with any achievements, let alone some psychic powers. Nothing whatsoever. So whenever we declare, I'm God, Annal Haq, that, of course, raises some eyebrows, if not few hairs on someone's body in response, because it's a bold statement. It is a very, very anti-religious statement, if we understand religion as that, when there is God as that supreme reality, and we are little earthlings in relation to that supreme reality. Then it can cause some very, very, very possible dilemmas to reconcile. However, from the standpoint of view of certain philosophies, from standpoint of view of certain doctrines, it is precisely what is required. In Tantra, and you brought the quote of venerated Swami Lakshmanju, who was one of the few adepts who traces his lineage all the way back, they say, to the 10th century sages, namely Abhinavagupta and so forth, to the whole myriad of them, the sages of Kashmir Shaivism. And Kashmir Shaivism, it's that ultimate refinement of tantric perspective, where that recognition that I am Shiva is essentially a prerequisite. Forget about tantric Shaivism now. Let's speak about something which is closer to home. It is that term, I am that I am. And we have brought this many times again. I am that I am. I'm not that, and I'm not this. It's not that I am this in relation to that. Virtue is, by definition, is something in relation to something else. This is indeed a virtue. This humility is a virtue. But the fact that I am is not a virtue. All virtues are reconciled in that statement of I am. My essence does not give a slightest iota of a hood of what quality I contain as my own. And that would, by definition, that term I am Shiva, or I am that I am. So there is no dilemma in your question, as you can see, whatsoever. There is nothing that you need to worry about in terms of what do I work first on. Yes, you do work on your virtues, and if humility you find something that is what you need to work on, that's great, you have your field. But that recognition of your essential nature, you have to have that before you brush your teeth in the morning and before you put anything into your mouth. You need to have that and hold that at all times, before you quench the thirst when you're thirsty, before you set your eye on something which is pretty or ugly, before you touch anything that will ignite that sense, because that's what ignites it all in the first place, and it is that recognition. Some times ago, perhaps 2 years to the date, at the Rolston retreat in Mill Valley, just coming to the Halloween, as we do. We talked about this at the Feminine Powers of God in California 2 years ago. We've talked precisely about this topic that these Mahavakyas, great sayings, great acknowledgements, can be practiced as sadhana in its own right. It can, and I shared that with the group, with some of you who are here now with us. You might remember when I said that this came to me spontaneously during one of my extensive sittings, when it just simply arose, just like that. It wasn't premeditated, it just bubbled up as that aham brahmasmi. Not that I had the need to verbalize that. It's just bubbled up, just like this faintest, subtlest thought, and it came in Sanskrit. It's interesting. Way before I actually delved into what this is. I'm only saying that there are some archetypal realizations that are all there. And I advise you to look into this with crystal clear clarity so that you don't waste time on dilemmas, which virtues to work on. You work on any virtues as you wish, but that supremacy of your identity has to be before anything, before any virtue. You see? Now, you might protest and say, well, but you said something else altogether, which I always do all the time. This is nothing new. That's what spiritual discourse is, to say one thing today and then completely negate that and say something tomorrow. Once you will begin to delve into this work, you will understand that this is the part of the spiritual discourse. The means, the upayas, are different each time. You will understand the different means employed at different moments. If the highest mean doesn't work, one would not hammer it. One would have to have a concession and carry on. But since you posed the question, the response to that question is that don't mix apples and pears. The nature of your reality is not a virtue. It transcends all of them. Annihilates any goodness or wickedness in you. Everything becomes your own self. Nothing that you can say that is good or bad, but mind make it so. So dwell on that for a while. Ponder on that, sit with that. And then it will become very clear what to work on and what has to be that underlying foundational ground, foundational understanding. Now, there is something else I'd like to mention here, because there is this, what you call to question, is that greatness, and also exemplified by the quote from Swami Lakshmanju, is that whatever you think, you become. Literally, whatever you think, that is in the virtue of consciousness itself. You see? The limitation of the language. Language now forces us to speak with these terms. These terms are inevitably come out of the tongue because these terms exist in the language. Virtue of the language. Virtue of consciousness. Listen to this carefully. Soon as something is clear and becomes dressed in concepts, it diminishes its immediacy. Therefore, one day you will be startled. So be startled now. That I amness, that I am that I am. has nothing to do with who you are as a human being. Nothing whatsoever, and never will. No lofty self-realization can make you into another being. These are wishful thinking. This is not what enlightenment is about. But on the way to that, a lot of things can happen, of course. And therefore, spiritual traditions vary in terms of the emphasis on virtues. And I simply suggested, work on your virtues now, because there's nothing else you can do. Grace does this work for you. Surrender to grace, and that's what this work is about. And in response to what we are to do then, if all this is grace, I did say virtues and vigilance, double V, V and V, virtues and vigilance. I hope this somehow clarifies this for you. And with that, we can move to the next question. Just one thing I wanted to add, yes, just one thing, is that in your question you say, so there is a great value in being constantly aware of our greatness, and there is tremendous value in humility. You see, it's easy to agree with that, but I'm reluctant to do that. It's easy to agree. Let me read the question again for everyone. Let me read this exposition here. There is a great value in being constantly aware of our greatness, and there's a tremendous value in humility. Well, you see that it depends what do you have and what do you imply when you say greatness. Greatness of I am, the greatness of I am Shiva, or the greatness of simply Aham, I am, is not a greatness that we use in terms of the human language, even if sometimes we come through the passages that enlightenment is the loftiest achievement available to humankind. Yes, it is spoken, and it is spoken by great Mahatmas, by great beings. But it's not that kind of greatness, you see. It is not the greatness of, oh, that being is greater than the other. Achievement of that being is much greater than the other. We can compare great artists with each other, great scientists, great politicians, great saints even. But we cannot compare the enlightened beings. They are incomparable. That I amness is incomparable. There's nothing that you can compare because there's no point of reference. When you get that, when you understand that, then it will become very clear to you that nothing you can do to actually cultivate this as a virtue, because it's not a virtue to begin with. That greatness has nothing to do with you, because when you think that that greatness is there, it will create crevices for the ego to hide. First this gross ego, but then it will become much subtler. So get rid of this notion right now and right here. And yes, it takes some humility and it takes some courage to acknowledge that.